And he said, in fact, I'm going to testify against the officers who did this. He testified against the police officers in October of 2008. The same officers came to his house in November of 2008, November 24th, 2008, at 8 in the morning, in front of his wife and 2 children, and arrested him, put him in pretrial detention, and then started to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in a cell, first with 8 inmates and 4 beds, so that they had to sleep in shifts, and they left the lights on 24 hours a day to try to sleep deprive them. After they had softened him up, then they came to him and said, are you ready to withdraw your testimony and sign a false confession saying that you did everything you're accusing us of? And he said, no, absolutely not. Sergei couldn't believe it. I mean, he was a truly black and white man of the law. The last thing he was going to do was sign any false confessions. They then put him in a cell in December without any window panes and no heat in Moscow, where they literally almost froze him to death. After that, they put him into a cell with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up from the floor. And every time they would move him from cell to cell, they would lose his most important belongings. And his most important belonging was a metal coil device that you plug into the wall, which allows you to boil water, because the water you can't drink in these prisons. Well, after drinking very bad water, after his immune system was totally shot from no sleep and cold and sewage, after 6 months of this, he got sick, real sick. He lost 40 pounds, and he developed pancreatitis and gallstones. And at the prison hospital, and very, very painful stuff. At the prison hospital, they said, we're going to give you an operation. They diagnosed him in July of 2009 and said, in August 2nd, we're going to operate on you to remove the gallstones. 1 week before his operation was scheduled, the investigators came to him again and said, are you ready to sign the false confession? He said, under no circumstances am I going to sign the false confession. I don't care what pain I'm suffering. And so they said, okay. And the next day they moved him from the prison that had a hospital, had a medical facility, to a prison called Butyrka, which for anyone who knows Russia is a truly horrific place. It's like a maximum security prison, the most horrifying place. And most importantly, it had no medical facilities. And at Butyrka, things really got bad. His health went into free fall. He had no access to any kind of medical care. He applied officially for medical attention 20 different times to his lawyers, to the investigators, the judges, the general prosecutor, the prison officials. Every single request was either ignored or outright denied. He went into such pain that there were times when his cellmate would bang on the door for hours trying to get someone to come and see him, and they would just ignore the pleas. And finally, things just got too much. On the night of November 16th, Sergei Magnitsky went into critical condition. At that point, they did move him to a hospital. They moved him back to the prison that had the hospital. But at the hospital, they didn't treat him. They put him into a straitjacket, put him in an isolation room, and waited 1 hour and 18 minutes until he died. He was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. How do I know all this? Well, everybody has their own way of dealing with adversity, and Sergei's way was to write it all down in the form of criminal complaints. He wrote criminal complaints about the crimes being committed against him by these authorities. And he wrote 450 of these complaints and filed them during his 358 days in detention. And while they laughed at him for writing the complaints, thinking we're never going to do anything about this, every time his lawyer filed a complaint on his behalf, we got a copy of it. And it's these 450 complaints that make up a body of evidence which is as compelling as Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago was for the Gulag period many decades ago. There is no body of evidence that shows the inside of Russian prison system like what Sergei Magnitsky's complaints look like. And on the day he died, I released one of his complaints, which was a 40-page handwritten letter to the General Prosecutor of Russia describing some of these things I've just described to you and many others. And one of the main independent newspapers of Russia, Novaya Gazeta, read this. They couldn't believe it. Everybody thought, nobody knew that this was what was going on inside the prison system. And they published it on the front page of their newspaper every day for the next week, just calling it Sergei's Prison Diaries. And when the Russian population saw this, they couldn't believe it. There's a social contract in Russia, which is if you keep your head out of politics and out of strategic industries and out of human rights, then you can go about enjoying the fruits of an authoritarian regime. But Sergei Magnitsky didn't have his head in any of that stuff. He wasn't an oligarch or a politician. He was a tax lawyer. He happened to be working for the wrong client, and he happened to discover a major crime, and he felt like doing the right thing as a citizen. And as a result of that, he was taken out of his middle-class life where he buys his Starbucks coffee in the morning and sits in his cubicle, and taken to the worst hellish dungeon in Russia and tortured to death in the most unpleasant way. And the people in Russia couldn't tolerate that. And the people in Russia started speaking out in the most politically incorrect ways after he died. And a week after his death, the president of Russia, who's made the legal reform of Russia his main sort of presidency agenda item, and stamping out legal nihilism as his main objective, couldn't possibly do nothing after the situation. So he called for an investigation into the death of Sergei Magnitsky. But you have to understand that the people who stole $230 million were not low-level people. They were extremely high-level people. And we've since discovered they've stolen many more millions of dollars, probably billions of dollars. And it probably goes right up to various cabinet ministers. And so as much as Medvedev may or may not want to solve this problem, there's a lot of people who certainly don't want to solve this problem, and they made sure that the problem didn't get solved. Shortly after, a week after he died, the Interior Ministry held a press conference and said, "We don't know what all this fuss is about. This man never complained about his health, in spite of the fact that on a website there's all the documents in his handwriting complaining about his health." And then they did an autopsy, which, by the way, they didn't ever allow the family to do their own autopsy or even have an independent expert attend the state autopsy. And they said the autopsy has determined that his heart stopped. It happens. It's nobody's fault. Of course, everybody's heart stops when you die. They had a few more press conferences where they tried to rub in the fact that he was a vicious criminal to ruin his name. All of the investigators who he named in all of his criminal complaints and the ones who have their names on the documents denying him medical attention have been promoted. And today, just today, it's called Police Day in Russia. It's Police Day in Russia, and the Interior Ministry awarded the highest honors to 32 different policemen in Russia for their work. 5 of those policemen were the policemen who were most responsible for the death of Sergei Magnitsky.